Imagine that a person commits a serious crime. Now ask yourself a very simple question. Why did this person commit the crime? Was the person possessed by an evil spirit? Did the person freely choose to commit the crime? Was the criminal influenced by poverty, employment, or social condition? Was there something unusual about the person's body or biological constitution? Or could crime be connected to patterns that we can observe across an entire population? Interestingly, criminologists have answered these questions very differently at different points in history, and that is exactly what makes the schools of criminology so fascinating. The history of criminology is, in many ways, the history of our changing understanding of the criminal. We moved from explanations based on supernatural forces to explanations based on free will and rational choice, then towards scientific explanations involving biological, psychological, and social factors. In today's video, we are going to travel through this fascinating intellectual journey. We will understand the demonological school, classical school, neoclassical school, positivist or positive school, cartographic school, biological school, constitutional school, and most importantly, we will understand the major thinkers, assumptions, concepts, contributions, and criticisms of each school so that you can confidently answer UGC NET questions. So let's begin our journey not from a modern laboratory but from a time when crime was often explained through demons, spirits, and supernatural forces. The demonological school represents one of the earliest ways of explaining criminal and deviant behavior. Before criminology developed as a scientific discipline, people did not have modern concepts of psychology, sociology, genetics, or neuroscience. So, when something terrible happened, such as murder, violent behavior, unusual conduct, or destruction of property, people often searched for an explanation in the supernatural world. The central belief was that criminal or deviant behavior could be caused by evil spirits, demons, supernatural forces, witchcraft, possession, or other mystical influences. In simple words, the criminal was not necessarily seen as someone who rationally chose crime. The person could be viewed as someone controlled or influenced by an external supernatural force. This was a very different understanding of criminality from what we have today. According to demonological explanations, evil behavior could be the result of possession by a supernatural entity. For example, if a person suddenly displayed extreme aggression, strange behavior, or violent tendencies, the explanation might not be a psychological disorder or neurological condition. Instead, people might believe an evil spirit has entered this person. As a result, responses to deviant behavior often involved religious or supernatural methods rather than scientific investigation. Rituals, exorcism, punishment, religious intervention, and other practices could be used to deal with the perceived source of the problem. An important feature of demonological thinking was the close connection between crime, sin, and evil. Crime was often understood through a moral or religious framework, therefore, punishment could be extremely severe. The purpose was not necessarily rehabilitation or understanding the causes of criminal behavior. Instead, punishment could be intended to remove evil, protect society, satisfy moral or religious expectations, deter others, or restore the perceived moral order. You might wonder, if demonological explanations were not scientific, why do we study them in criminology? Because they help us understand the historical development of criminological thought. The demonological school represents an early stage where criminal behavior was explained primarily through supernatural and religious beliefs. Later, schools gradually challenged this approach and began asking, can crime be explained through human behavior and rational principles instead? That question brings us to the classical school. The classical school represents a major turning point in the history of criminology. Why? because the explanation of crime shifted away from demons and supernatural forces and towards human rationality, free will, and choice. The classical school developed primarily during the 18th century, particularly during the Enlightenment. Think about what the Enlightenment emphasized: reason, rationality, individual freedom, equality, and human rights. These ideas had a tremendous influence on criminal justice. These two names that you absolutely need to remember are Caesar Beccaria and Jeremy Bentham. Caesar Beccaria was one of the most influential thinkers associated with the classical school. His famous work on crimes and punishments was Beccaria's strongly criticized arbitrary, cruel, and excessive punishment. He believed that criminal justice system should be based on reason, fairness, and proportionality. The classical school assumed that human beings possess free will. This means individuals are capable of making choices. A person weighs the possible advantages and disadvantages of an action and decides whether to engage in it. Therefore, crime could be viewed as a rational choice. Imagine a person thinking, if I commit this offense, I may gain something, but if I am caught, I may be punished. The person is therefore making a calculation. This leads us to one of the most important concepts associated with the classical school, the hedonistic calculus. Human beings are assumed to seek pleasure and avoid pain. So, according to the classical perspective, an individual may compare potential pleasure or benefit from crime against potential pain or punishment resulting from crime. If the perceived benefit is greater than the expected cost, the individual may choose crime. Jeremy Bentham developed the idea of utilitarianism. The basic principle can be summarized as the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Bentham believed that human behavior is influenced by the pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain. Therefore, punishment should serve a useful social purpose. Punishment itself causes pain, so why should society impose it? Because punishment should produce a greater benefit by preventing crime. This is where the concept of deterrence becomes extremely important. The classical school placed enormous importance on deterrence. There are two broad forms of deterrence, that is general deterrence and specific deterrence. In general deterrence, punishing one offender sends a message to other members of society saying, if you commit the same offense, you may also be punished. Therefore, punishment discourages the general population from committing crime, and in specific deterrence, the punishment is intended to discourage the particular offender from committing crime again. Let's bring the major characteristics together. The classical school emphasized free will, that is, individuals possess the capacity to choose. Rationality, people make rational calculations before acting. Hedonism, people seek pleasure and avoid pain. Equality before law, people should be treated equally under the law. Proportionality, punishment should correspond to the seriousness of the offense. Certainty and promptness of punishment, punishment should be predictable and reasonably certain. Deterrence, punishment should discourage future crime. And legal reform, the criminal justice system should be rational, fair, and predictable. Before the classical school, criminal justice could involve arbitrary decisions and extremely harsh punishments. The classical thinkers argued that punishment should not be based simply on revenge. Instead, it should be rational, proportionate, certain, and predictable. This was a major contribution to modern criminal justice. But the classical school had limitations. It assumed that people generally possess the ability to make rational choices. But are all offenders equally capable of making such choices? What about children, persons with severe mental disorders, and people with cognitive limitations? The classical model could not adequately explain these differences. This limitation helped contribute to the emergence of the neoclassical school. The neoclassical school developed as a modification of the classical approach, and this is an important point. Neoclassical criminology did not completely reject the classical school. Instead, it modified and softened some of its assumptions, particularly the idea that all individuals possess the same level of free will and rationality. Imagine two people commit the same offense. One is fully mature adult who carefully planned the crime. The second is a young child who acted impulsively and did not fully understand the consequences. Should both receive exactly the same treatment? The neoclassical thinkers recognized that perhaps they should not. Therefore, the neoclassical school introduced greater attention to individual circumstances. The neoclassical approach recognized that circumstances may influence responsibility. Factors such as age, mental condition, circumstances surrounding the offense, degree of intention, and other mitigating circumstances could be considered while determining criminal responsibility and punishment. This represented an important shift. The classical school largely focused on the crime and the rational choice. The neoclassical school began paying greater attention to the offender and circumstances surrounding the crime. One of the most important ideas to remember is mitigation. A mitigating circumstance is a factor that may reduce the seriousness of the offender's responsibility or justify a less severe punishment. For example, age or certain circumstances surrounding the offense may influence how responsibility is assessed. This helped create a more flexible approach to criminal justice. The neoclassical school helped introduce greater individualization of punishment. Instead of treating every offender exactly alike, the justice system could consider relevant differences between offenders. This laid the groundwork for later developments, including juvenile justice, individualized sentencing, mental incapacity consideration, and differentiated treatment of offenders. Here is a very important examination comparison. Free will leads to rational choice and equal responsibility and then proportional punishment. Neoclassical school, free will but with exceptions, individual circumstances, differentiated responsibility and individualized punishment. So remember, classical school equals to uniformity and rational choice, whereas neoclassical school gives importance to flexibility and individual circumstances. Now we reach another major turning point. The classical school asked, why does a person choose crime? The positivist school asked a somewhat different question, what causes a person to commit crime? This is a fundamental shift. The classical school emphasized free will. The positivist or positive school emphasized determinism. Positivism is associated with the idea that criminal behavior should be studied scientifically. Instead of relying primarily on philosophical speculation, criminologists should observe, measure, and analyze behavior. In other words, crime should be studied scientifically, just like other social or natural phenomena. The positivist school, therefore, encouraged the use of observation, measurement, classification, empirical investigation, and scientific methods. This is one of the most important concepts, that is determinism. According to the positivist perspective, behavior may be influenced by factors beyond an individual's conscious free choice. These factors could include biological factors, psychological factors, social factors, environmental factors, and other conditions. Therefore, the criminal was increasingly viewed not simply as someone who chooses evil, but as someone whose behavior could be influenced by identifiable causes. Three names are particularly important: Cesare Lombroso, Enrico Ferri, and Rafael Garofalo. A very useful memory trick is Lombroso introduced biological, Ferri introduced sociological, and Garofalo introduced natural crime. Cesare Lombroso is often described as one of the most important figures in development of positive criminology. He attempted to study criminals scientifically and proposed that some offenders could possess characteristics associated with criminality. His ideas became associated with the concept of the born criminal. Lombroso proposed that some individuals were atavistic, meaning they supposedly represented the reappearance of primitive characteristics. He believed certain physical characteristics could indicate a tendency towards criminal behavior. Now, this atavism, this word is extremely important for UGC NET. Atavism refers to the supposed reappearance of ancestral or their primitive traits. Lombroso argued that certain offenders could display physical features that he interpreted as signs of revolutionary throwbacks. He examined features such as unusual skull characteristic, jaw structure, facial characteristics, ears, and other bodily features. However, it is extremely important to understand modern criminology does not accept Lombroso's simple biological determinism. His work is historically important, but many of his conclusions were later criticized for methodological problems and overgeneralization. Lombroso later moved away from an entirely rigid concept of the born criminal and recognized different categories of offenders. His classification included ideas such as born criminals, occasional criminals, criminals by passion, and other categories. The important point for examination purposes is that Lombroso tried to classify offenders according to the characteristics and presumed causes. This reflected the positivist desire to scientifically study the offender. Now, let's move from Lombroso to Enrico Ferri. Ferri expanded the positivist approach. Unlike an explanation based exclusively on biological factors, Ferri emphasized that criminal behavior could result from a combination of anthropological, physical, and social factors. He therefore gave considerable importance to the social environment. Factors such as poverty, social conditions, population conditions, economic circumstances, and environmental influences could contribute to criminal behavior. So, if Lombroso is strongly associated with biological explanation, Ferri is strongly associated with sociological explanation of positivism. The third major thinker is Rafael Garofalo. Garofalo is especially important for his concept of natural crime. Garofalo attempted to identify crime through certain fundamental violations of basic sentiments. He emphasized ideas associated with pity and probity. According to Garofalo, certain behaviors could be considered naturally criminal because they violated fundamental sentiments necessary for social life. Let's pause here. The classical school said the offender chooses crime. The positivist school increasingly said the offender's behavior has causes that can be scientifically investigated. This transformed criminology. The criminal was no longer studied only through the offense. The criminal himself became an object of scientific investigation. Now we move to a school that is particularly interesting because it shifts our attention from the individual offender to something much larger, that is geography. The Cartographic school is also known as the geographical school. Its central question was, where does crime occur and what patterns can we identify geographically? This was an important development because researchers began noticing that crime was not randomly distributed across society. Certain areas appeared to have consistently higher crime rates than others. Two important names are Adolf Quetelet and Andre Michael Gary. These thinkers used statistical and geographical methods to study crime. Adolf was an Belgian mathematician and statistician who made major contribution to the statistical study of social phenomena. He examined crime rates and noticed patterns in relation to factors such as age, sex, season, social conditions, and geographical location. This was extremely significant because if crime rates show regular patterns across population, then crime cannot simply be understood as a completely random individual event. There may be social and environmental regularities influencing crime. Andre also used statistical information to examine the distribution of crime. He produced crime maps and compared crime with various social factors. This helped establish the importance of geographical and statistical analysis in criminology. The basic idea was map the crime, identify its patterns, examine the conditions associated with those patterns. The cartographic or geographical school contributed to an important realization: crime can be studied at the population level. Instead of asking only why did this particular individual commit this crime, researchers could ask why does this region have a higher crime rate, or why are particular types of crime more common in certain areas or seasons. This eventually contributed to the development of modern approaches involving crime mapping, spatial analysis, environmental criminology, geographic information systems, and crime pattern analysis. Its greatest contribution was the use of statistics and geographical analysis in criminological research. It demonstrated that crime has patterns, and once you can identify those patterns, you can begin asking what social or environmental conditions are producing those patterns. Now we come to one of the most controversial and historical important schools, the Biological School of Criminology. The Biological School attempted to explain criminal behavior through biological characteristics or processes. This could include factors relating to heredity, genetics, physiology, neurological functioning, and physical constitution. The basic question was, could there be something biological about an individual that increases the likelihood of criminal behavior? Once again, we encounter Cesar Lombroso. Lombroso's work is often considered a foundation of early biological criminology. His idea of the born criminal suggested that certain offenders possessed inherited or evolutionary characteristics associated with criminality. However, we need to be careful. Modern criminology does not accept the idea that a particular physical appearance can identify someone as criminal. The historical significance lies in the attempt to move from supernatural explanations towards empirical study of the offender. Later, biological approaches explored whether criminal behavior could have hereditary components. Researchers investigators questions like, could certain behavioral tendencies have genetic influences? Could neurological or physiological characteristics influence aggression or impulsivity? Modern research recognizes that biological factors can interact with psychological and environmental factors, but there is an important distinction. Biological influence does not mean biological destiny. Having a particular biological characteristic does not automatically make someone a criminal. Crime is a complex phenomenon. One of the major criticisms of early biological criminology was biological determinism. The concern was that if researchers concluded that certain physical or biological characteristics directly cause crime, they might ignore social environment, family, education, poverty, peer influence, culture, opportunity, and individual decision making. There were also serious methodological problems in some early studies. Therefore, modern criminology generally favors multifactorial explanation rather than a simple biological cause. The constitutional school is closely related to biological explanation but deserves separate attention. Its central idea is that individuals' constitutional makeup or bodily build may be associated with behavioral tendencies. One of the most famous thinkers associated with this approach is William Sheldon. William Sheldon and somatotypes is the famous theory. Sheldon developed a theory of body types known as somatotyping. He proposed three major body types: endomorph, mesomorph, and ectomorph. Endomorphs are associated with the softer and rounder body build. Mesomorphs are associated with the muscular and athletic body build, and ectomorphs are associated with the relatively thin and delicate body build. Sheldon suggested that different body types could be associated with different temperamental characteristics. He particularly associated mesomorphic body types with greater tendency towards physical activity and in some of his research delinquency. But again, this does not mean muscular people are criminals. That would be an incorrect interpretation. Sheldon's work belongs to his historical phase in criminology in which researchers were attempting to connect physical constitution with behavior. Modern criminology does not treat body type as a reliable predictor of criminality. Ernst Kritzmer, another important name associated with constitutional approaches, is this. Ernst classifies individuals according to body types such as leptosome or asthenic, athletic, and picnic. He attempted to relate physical constitution with personality and psychological characteristic. His work contributed to the broader constitutional approach to understanding behavior. The Constitution School is important because it represents an attempt to connect physical constitution, temperament, and behavior. This was part of the broader search for explanations of criminality that moved beyond purely legal definitions of crime. However, as with early biological theories, constitutional theories have been criticized for oversimplification, weak causal explanations, methodological limitation, stereotyping, and failure to adequately account for social and environmental influences. Now let's step back and look at the entire journey. Imagine criminological thought as a long road. At the beginning of the road, people asked, is the person controlled by evil forces? That takes us to the Demonological school. Then came the Enlightenment and the idea, no, human beings have free will and make rational choices. That gives us the Classical school. Then thinkers realized, but not everyone has exactly the same capacity for rational choice. That brings us to the Neoclassical school. Then the question changed. Instead of simply assuming free will, can we scientifically discover the causes of crime? That gives us Positivist school. Then researchers began asking, where does crime occur and what patterns can we find? That gives us Cartographic school. At the same time, researchers began asking, could biology or physical characteristics contribute to criminal behavior? That gives us Biological school. And then, could an individual's physical constitution or body type be associated with behavioral tendencies? That leads us to the Constitutional school. Let's make this extremely easy to remember. Demonological school. The main explanation includes supernatural forces. Key idea has demons, spirits, possession, evil. Approach is religious and supernatural. Whereas in Classical school, the main explanation includes free will and rational choice. Key thinkers are Beccaria and Bentham. Key concepts include hedonism, deterrence, proportionality, and punishment. In Neoclassical school, the main importance is given to modified free will. The key idea includes individual circumstances matter. Important concepts are mitigating circumstances, age, mental condition, individualized punishment. In Positivist school, the main explanation includes deterministic causes. Key thinkers are Lombroso, Enrico Ferri, and Rafael Garofalo. Key concept is scientific study of crime and criminals. Cartographic school includes main explanation of geographical and social distribution of crime. Key thinkers are Quetelet and Gary. Key concepts include statistics, crime rates, geographical patterns, and crime mapping. Biological school includes biological factors. Key thinkers are Lombroso in early biological criminology, and key concepts are heredity, physiology, and biological characteristics. And the last, Constitutional school has importance in physical constitution and behavioral tendencies. Key thinkers are William Sheldon and Ernst Kritzmer. Key concepts include body type or constitution. And here is a very easy way to remember the evolution, a simple memory chain: demon, choice, circumstances, causes, map, body, and constitution. Or think of it as 7 questions. Who is controlling the person? Did the person choose crime? What circumstances affected that choice? What caused the behavior? Where does crime occur? What biological factors may influence behavior? Does physical constitution related to behavior? Once you understand this progression, remembering the schools becomes much easier. Before we end, let's quickly connect the major thinkers with their key ideas. Caesar Beccaria, Classical School. Important book was on crime and punishment. Jeremy Bentham, Utilitarianism, a plain and pressure principle, deterrence. Cesar Lombroso, Positivist of Biological Criminology, Born Criminal and Atavism. Enrico Ferri, Positivist School, Social and Multiple Factors. Rafael Garofalo, Positivist School, Natural Crime. Adolf Quetelet, Cartographic School, Statistical Study of Crime. Andre Michael Gary, Cartographic School, Crime Mapping or Statistical Geography. William Sheldon, Constitutional School, Somatotypes. Ernst Kritzmer, Constitutional Approach, Physics and Temperament. So, what we have learned from this journey, the history of criminological thought is essentially a story of changing explanations of crime. We began with the belief that crime could be caused by supernatural forces. Then the classical thinkers introduced the powerful idea of free will, rational choice, and deterrence. The neoclassical thinkers recognized that human beings are not identical and that individual circumstances can influence responsibility. The Positivist school shifted the focus towards scientific investigation and the causes of criminal behavior. The Cartographic school shifted the focus towards scientific investigation. The Cartographic school demonstrated that crime could be studied through statistics, geography, and patterns of distribution. The biological school explored whether biological factors could contribute to criminal behavior, and the constitutional school examined whether physical constitution and body type could be related to behavioral tendencies. But there is one final lesson that modern criminology teaches us. Crime is rarely explained by one factor alone. A person's behavior may be influenced by a complex interaction of biological, psychological, social, economic, cultural, environmental, and individual factors. Therefore, modern criminology has moved far beyond the idea that we can simply look at someone's appearance, background, or circumstances and declare this person is a criminal. Instead, criminology asks much more sophisticated questions, such as what factors contribute to the crime, how do those factors interact, why do some individuals exposed to similar circumstances offend while others do not, and most importantly, what can society do to prevent crime? That evolution from demons to data, from punishment to scientific inquiry, is what makes the history of criminological thought so fascinating. And with that, we come to the end of our detailed discussion on the schools of criminology. If you are preparing for UGC NET Criminology, don't just memorize the names of the schools. Try to remember the logic behind their evolution. Supernatural explanation, free will, then